One of the most important things when going into a Pokemon draft is having a plan. I mean, of course, you could just go in and be like, oh, I'm just gonna, play it out by vibes, let the whims of fate decide. But if you go in with a plan, chances are you're probably gonna come out with something that you're satisfied with. So in this video, just gonna kind of highlight a couple of different core ideas in terms of like general play styles and just things to look for when you're creating your draft team. So we're going to get into that with Fire, Water, Grass cores. This core has been present since the dawn of time. Quite literally, it was the first decision any of us ever made playing this video game. Obviously, with your choice of starter being Swampert, Blaziken, and Celebi, very obvious choice. Obviously we all picked Mudkip, but in terms of a Fire, Water, Grass core, what's really good about these three types in particular is their synergy together. In the case of water types, right, water is weak to grass and electric. Well, in this example, we're using Swampert, so we'll talk about grass especially. So when you have an incoming grass move, what are you going to go and switch out into? Probably a grass type, maybe even a fire type. And that can even go for that electric move. You can go into that grass type. It kind of covers that weakness well. And then if we look on to Celebi, who's weak to a lot of types, grass and psychic isn't the greatest defensive type in the world, but main ones of them being fire, ice, right? And water types can switch into those types very easily. And then if we look at Blaziken, Blaziken's a bit on the frail side, but the presence still stands, right? It could come in on the grass type moves aimed at Swampert, right? It could come in on the fire type moves aimed at Celebi, and then when there's water type attacks coming at it, it can go into Celebi or even Swampert or any other water type to kind of cover that weakness. With this core, you often exert a lot more pressure on your opponent because you'll have coverage moves too. So right, Swampert usually will carry a combination of like Hydro Pump, Surf, Earthquake, Ice Beam, and some other coverage, maybe even Protect, Toxic, something like that. Right, so you can try to, make predictions, oh, a grass type's coming in, I can Ice Beam, get a little bit of extra damage on it. Right, and Celebi's a Pokemon that has lots of really cool coverage moves. Like you could throw off some Ancient Powers on if you think Charizard's going to come in on you. You could throw off an Ancient Power if you have it, and you're going to feel like a genius when you do like 80% to it. So things like that, it's important to think about when you're putting your team together. It might not be these exact three. Even if you were to go all the way into lower tiers, right? Let's take an all low tier example. So what if we take Arcanine, right? We take something like Vileplume, and then let's see, what's a good water type down here? It doesn't have a second type. You know what? Let's take Politoed. I like Politoed. He's a cool guy. I like this video for Politoed. Right. So we got our very similar core. Right. Principles are still standing, even if you're using, a Pokemon that's not as good as Swampert, Celebi, or Blaziken. Right. The concept kind of carries on, and even if you don't plan on bringing, these three Pokemon to every single game. Right, having this kind of idea and type diversity in the builder helps you create a better defensive game plan while also still exerting what could be a really good offensive plan as well. I also want to talk about the importance of the steel type. We've done a lot of drafts at Sapa, and the most common factor has been the team with the really good steel type usually does the best. And, drafting advanced is not going to be any different. Skarmory is top 2. Alright, arguably the best. Right, we got Metagross, who's number 3, number 4, depending on who you ask. You have a bulky Pokemon like Jirachi, right? It could do a lot of things. Right, it could run Calm Mind, it could be bulky, Wish Protect. Right, Metagross usually leans more offensive with its huge 135 attack, but can also pull off a defensive role. Skarmory just being a defensive beast, while also having, Spike's the best move in the game. And you also have, an even more defensive steel in Fortress, who has a lot of roll compression. Right, Fortress can do a lot of things. you might want to draft a spinner, you might want to draft a spiker. But if you find yourself in a position where I need a steel type, I need a spiker, I need a spinner, you can cross all three off your list with one Pokemon, and in draft, that is huge, right? You could do a lot of different things with Fortress. Like, you don't even need to run spin in every game, right? If the person you're going up against doesn't have spikes, great. Now you can fit protect, you can fit refresh, stuff like that. And then you got, specialized Pokemon like Magneton, right? In draft, we've usually seen like Magnezone, Magneton, not quite be the force that you would expect, but Magneton has that incredible niche of when you play the Skarmory player, right? Their Skarm doesn't get to play the game, which is really cool, especially if you decide I'm going to build a team that might not be able to handle Skarm that well. There's no Shed Cell, it can't run away from you. But with a Pokemon like Magneton, honestly, I treat it more as an electric type than a steel type. Like you still have those, defensive niches, but your defensive stat spread is, there's a big difference between 50, 95, 70, and even looking at Metagross of 80, 130, 90, right? Magneton's more of an offensive threat. But, he could still do his magnet pull trapping duties. If you were to go up against the team with, Fortress, you can HP fire it, it's gone. You don't have to worry about spikes or spin anymore. And then even going into lower tiers, you got Pokemon like Registeel. Right, Registeel is even more of a defensive wall, right? You have consistent damage output with Seismic Toss. You have Explosion, right? It's a really good just like pivot in check using its really good defensive profile to kind of come in, and slow the game down if that's kind of what your team is like. You can spread status. You can do a lot of things, and when in doubt, just kind of throw them out there. But, one of the things with the steel type is you got to worry about, fire types, fighting types, ground types. 3 of the best offensive types in the game. Why do you think they're so good? It's because steel's the best defensive type. So when you're picking a really good steel, you obviously want to have those types in mind. So if you were to just draft 6 steel type Pokemon, everybody would just bring fighting and ground versus you, and you would lose. So a little bit on why type diversity is important. So even if you were to go in with this Fire, Water, Grass core, and then if you were to throw on, like, let's take the Swampert, Celebi, Blaziken one, we throw on Registeel, now we have even more layers of bulk and, more ways to pivot around, especially as things get low, right? So let's see, we take, Celebi and, let's say Swampert's, pretty low in HP, right? And he's kind of been our default check to, like, rock types, right? Like, going up against Tyranitar. All of a sudden, you also have Registeel. He can come in and eat that Rock Slide on the Choice Band Tyranitar, and then you can kind of get your momentum back. So things aren't always lost if you lose one member of your defensive core. So this is the part where I kind of give some, ideas for how you might want to pair some of, we call them the Big 8 for this format. The Pokemon that you can't have more than one of on your team. These are just a couple of ideas of how you can kind of push your particular play style, how you want to build, your offensive core. And we'll start with Spike's offense. So if you're looking to draft Skarmory, right, you got the first or second pick, and you want to pair Skarmory with something that is, can take advantage of spikes, right? The glorious thing with spikes is it's always applying passive damage, right? And if you got Pokemon like Aerodactyl, right? Choice Band Aerodactyl, it's so fast, it's basically a Choice Scarfer. It just does lots of damage. It's going to force a lot of switches, and if you have even just one layer of spikes, that damage adds up quickly, as whatever comes in is going to eat your Rock Slide, your Double Edge, and then you switch out, and then you just keep applying pressure, right? And then Skarmory is great because it can also phase in and out. Phase being like, Roar, Whirlwind, stuff like that. Just to continue to build up the damage until your opponent can't handle the power of these fast offensive threats. Jolteon especially, I think, is a really good partner for Skarmory, since Skarmory only has 2 weaknesses, being fire and electric. Jolteon is immune to electric. Even better, it heals, which is even better. So you can come in, if you're playing against the team with Zapdos, you bring Jolteon in on that Thunderbolt, you heal up, you're faster, right? You could baton pass out to Scout, you could throw off powerful Thunderbolts. right? Your offensive synergy and defensive synergy with spikes and Skarmory is huge, because you're going to force switches with Jolteon. You're going to get free momentum. Just things like that are really good to consider. And then I also threw Charizard and Salamence on here for other reasons, just like they're fast, they're strong, they're hard to switch into. Realistically, are you going to get Salamence if you get Skarmory? Probably not. Salamence is incredibly good, and if it's falling back to you at the end of the second round, I feel like someone has messed up with those other picks and did not go for an arguable top 5 Pokemon in the tier. So another thing with spikes, pairing them up with all the abusers is great, but you want to keep those spikes on the field. So Gengar, unfortunately for our draft, is not going to be compatible with Skarm due to them both being in the Big 8. Something like Misdreavus is basically a little mini Gengar. Is immune to spikes itself. It can come in, it can spin block, it can Calm Mind, it could do a lot of annoying things. There's Parasong Mean Look, which is always funny. Taunt, T-Wave. Misdreavus is a really good partner for Skarmory-based spikes offensive teams. If you're looking for that kind of core that you want to build your draft team around. And now, running offense isn't the only way to use spikes. You can also do it more defensively. Right? I threw Blissey on here just because the principle of building a more balanced team. You want to control the pace of the game. You want to slow it down. You want to use your fat Pokemon to kind of position yourself stronger so your more offensive threats can kind of power through. I've talked about Fortress with its roll compression. Fortress is a good Pokemon to fit on these teams, so you have more room for another wall. Even if there's a wall, let's say a core like we got, let's say Milotic and Blissey, right? Very hard wall to break through. You're going to want something with electric coverage, fighting coverage. You know, you're going to want to pair that up with Pokemon that are going to deal with that. Something like Dusclops, who also has huge defensive stats, can be annoying, acts as a spin blocker for any other spinner you have. You could build a really nasty core that's hard to break. And then you can pair it even with something like Armaldo, who has Rapid Spin, the option for knockoff, unfortunately not together due to how egg move compatibility works. But something like this, if you want to play a more drawn out style, it's going to be hard to break, especially with the power level kind of scattered throughout the format. This is a potential core and combo that's going to be hard to deal with, and only, you know, really good teams and good players are going to be able to find the ways through that. And as the season progresses, you know, we might see, oh, you know, everybody starts to pick up on it once the crack in the armor breaks, you know, and then you got to adapt your game plan and things like that. So that's just a little bit on bulky spikes. Again, there's more partners you can have. Celebi with its Leech Seed, Wish Protect, Toxic Jirachi, Claydol, another good spinner. I already talked about Dusclops, and then you could go and grab spikers in the low tier like Quillfish. Quillfish is pretty solid with Blissey just because you resist the fighting attacks. And you can get up spikes, and then you can explode, which is really good. So you can continue to apply some offensive pressure while also still positioning yourself to be more defensive and bulky. Alright, and for the person that doesn't get Skarmory, or the person who has the first pick, they get to play with Tyranitar and his meta-defining Sandstream. So, Toxic Sandstorm Spikes is the defining playstyle of Advanced. So, you get to play it, and nobody else does, which is really cool. You know, with it being a draft team, you want to kind of pair Tyranitar up with Pokemon that are going to benefit from it. And with the small roster size you're going to have, this is another example of roll compression is going to be really important. And how are you going to maximize Tyranitar's Sandstream without having Pokemon like Skarmory, Pokemon like Swampert to back you up? So, I've talked about Fortress to death. No need to harp on him. Cloyster is another example. It's a bit more offensive with its higher offensive attacking stats. You still have Explosion, Surf, Ice Beam, right? You can play a bit more offensively with Cloyster than you can with Fortress just because of how the stat distribution is. Claydol is a great partner for Tyranitar if you want to play a more defensive-based game plan if you want to focus your top-tier picks into a stronger defensive core, which typically in our drafts, those really strong defensive cores tend to go farther than just going all out on the offense because they have ways to adapt to all the other teams. I want to highlight Steelix because Steelix is kind of like a mini Metagross without, you know, Meteor Mash and 135 attack. First off, you're immune to sand. It's awesome, right? You have Rockhead. You got a pretty respectable 85 attack. You know, you can make it work with Stab Earthquake. I mean, anything with Stab Earthquake and an attacking stat over 80 and a Choice Band is going to do some big damage, right? Like I've said in other videos, power level's lower. You know, so these little 85 attacks, they might sting a little bit, you know, with that Choice Band. So Steelix, Tyranitar have good synergy. You just are going to want to pair it with, you know, a Ghost type to be immune to the fighting types. You know, you're going to want a strong Water type, you know, to take the other Water type attacks, maybe a Grass type in that same vein. And then I also want to highlight knockoff, I guess, Hariyama in general, since he's probably the best user of it. I talked about it a little bit with Armaldo, but Hariyama gets thick fat, so you half damage from fire type moves and ice type moves, which is really good, especially if you were to go with something like Steelix on your team as well. Now, if you are pairing Hariyama with, say, you know, let's say you got Cloyster, Tyranitar, Steelix, Hariyama, right? You've got your spikes, you got your spin, you got your sand. You got your really bulky Steel over here, who's actually healing in sand, right? The only Pokemon that heal in sand, ground, steel, rock types. Right, Steelix gets to kind of, you know, exist. You know, you can run a more defensive set, right? Protect Toxic. You know, you're healing, your opponent is not, they're taking damage. If you knock off their lefties, you know, that's HP they're not going to get back. Alright, and Hariyama's no slouch, right? 120 attack is no joke. You know, fighting is one of the best offensive types, as I mentioned earlier, right? And not only that, you have guts. So if you come in on like a stray Will-O-Wisp from the Gengar team, all of a sudden that Brick Break is doing a lot of damage. You've got Earthquake, you've got Rock Slide. Right, this Pokemon is really good. Arguably the best borderline. There's a chance if Tier Shift happens before our draft, this Pokemon's probably going to rise up. Which is pretty cool. Good for Hariyama, you know. Hariyama stands rejoice. But even though there's good Pokemon for sand teams, there's also poor. I put that with the little asterisk because you obviously can make it work. But Suicune loves its leftovers. Like, that's his best friend. You don't see Suicune leave home without it. Snorlax is another example. These are Pokemon that don't really like sand. They're probably going to want something to clear the weather if they really want to focus on a sweep. So if you're in a position, you absolutely can take them. They're phenomenal. Starmie also falls in this because you're switching in to Spikes damage that you can't heal off if you don't have Recover. So that kind of limits what Starmie can do in every game because you have to deal with your own sand. This is something that you created, and now these other Pokemon are kind of struggling because of it. So just things to keep in mind. You absolutely could go for it, but you might find that, you know, Suicune's not pulling its weight as much as it could, you know, if you didn't have sand. So the thing with Dugtrio, right? Arena Trap basically delete anything on the ground. You know, if it's weak to ground, you can just get rid of it. Right? And trapping Blissey, especially if you're against the Blissey player, or even Chansey, right? All of a sudden, I gotta charge my laptop. Haha. Good thing we're almost done. So Jirachi with Calm Mind, right? Suicune, Calm Mind. These are good Pokemon to pair with it. Like I'd mentioned with Suicune not liking sand, pairing Suicune with a Rain Dance sweeper like Kingdra, right? Dugtrio can trap Tyranitar. Kingdra can come in, set up the rain. Now all of a sudden you have this really good offensive duo here. And then you can have something with, like, you know, Baton Pass and a stat that you can make, you know, Jirachi even faster, right? You can drop your speed, you could pump up your bulk, start Calm Minding. Their greatest walls are nothing because you trapped them with Dugtrio. This is an example where having a strong offensive draft is really going to benefit you, because you're going to put your opponent on the back foot. You're going to make them play at your pace because they can't rely on their fat walls if they're just going to get removed. And now all of a sudden, boom, they lose to Suicune. And that's not great. Alright, so last section here is more just for offensive pressure. I want to highlight Zapdos, just because 125 special attack, Stab Thunderbolt. Electric types have historically dominated our drafts, especially the electric Zapdos, Raikou. So pairing Zapdos with other offensive threats is really good. Starmie, a good example. The first real draft we ever did in DPP, I had Zapdos, Starmie, and Metagross. I went undefeated. These two have a really good defensive profile together. There's no Stealth Rock, but still, regardless, Starmie can spread paralysis, and then something like Heracross can come in. Now it's fast, right? Rhydon is a Pokemon that really wants to do a lot of damage. And then Glalie for spikes, right? Just putting on a lot of pressure. Alright, and in that same vein, we have the fuck it, we ball. Alright, one of my old professors said flexibility is the cornerstone of mobility in terms of physical therapy, but it can apply to Pokemon too. These Pokemon just have tons of offensive options. You can literally do whatever you want. You pick your coverage on Gengar, it'll be good. Pick your coverage on Mence. You want to be DD, CB, Mix, go for it, it's great. Same with Jirachi. Charizard's really strong. And Dragonite is just Mence, but slightly worse. But in draft, it's going to pull its weight and it'll be fine. Alright, so that's pretty much all I've got in terms of Pokemon cores to draft. Again, these are just suggestions. You could do whatever the hell you want. But I hope some of this helped spark some planning for you. Best of luck in the draft. This is going to be the last video that goes up until our draft happens, because I have to take my boards and I'm going on vacation. So once I come back, we'll have draft, we'll have a little breakdown, and it'll be a good time. So thanks for watching. Appreciate the support on the last videos. Means a lot. So we'll see you in the next one.